Okay, simple summary for this week. I want to talk about three people in particular, but I also want to talk about this period that we are studying, which is the decade or so before the Civil War began. First, a disclaimer. When I talk about somebody like, say, Henry Clay, if I compliment that person, or if I say something positive about that person, it is not necessarily an endorsement of that person, because these people that we're studying in history are human beings. They're not perfect. They're not. I'm not even necessarily saying they're mostly good. I call it like I see it. And Henry Clay did a lot of good for the country, but I'm also, frankly, not going to defend somebody who owned slaves personally. So it's not just an unqualified endorsement of somebody. Having said that, during the 18 teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, there were three major figures in Congress. Did they all do the right things all the time? Did they all represent issues the way I would like them personally to 200 years later? No. But they represented their constituents, and they were big, huge, important figures. And the fact that the royal we, do not know their names later unless you teach history for a living, doesn't mean they weren't important. They were still titans. The three people are Henry Clay, who I've mentioned before, who represented Kentucky. At the time, Kentucky was considered the West. We had not expanded that far, right? He was a Westerner from Kentucky, which makes no sense to me now geographically. The second person was Daniel Webster, who represented New England in the Congress. And the third was John C. Calhoun, who represented the South in the Congress. And I'm not going to get too much into details like this person's from South Carolina, blah, blah, blah. But basically, the gist of it is the three people represented three different sections of the country and three different points of view. But they also found ways, mostly Clay, not more than Webster or Calhoun, to generate compromises to prevent wars from breaking out. Slavery had existed in this country before the United States even declared its independence. And it was an undercurrent all along, because people understood in 1776 implicitly, when they were declaring independence from Great Britain, that they were talking about freedom, but that they were also quietly going along with taking away other people's freedom. There were discussions of anti-slavery stuff at the time in the 1770s, but the founding fathers, apart from the ones who had slaves, even the ones who are anti knew, like, there's no way we can get where we need to go if we fight that fight right now. We wouldn't get people to support independence. The South would just, melt away and side with Great Britain. So they've been kicking this problem down the road for a long time. And you could argue that's what Clay was doing by forging compromises, like in 1820, where you kind of split the difference, and you're not really getting rid of slavery. You're just trying to limit its growth, or you're saying you can have it in these places but not in other places. But it was the best, probably, that could be done to hold the country together. The problem is, when you're reliant on a particular person or a group of people, then rather than a system might endure. People are going to get old and die. It's just how it works, or at a place of employment. If only one person really knows how to do the job and that guy's sick or that guy quits, good luck. Same kind of problem for the country on a bigger scale, because Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, by the late 1840s, they were getting old. All of them were dead by the mid 1850s. And the people who replaced them just weren't that good. They weren't as skilled at legislation as those people were. Here's another problem. The United States goes to war with Mexico. Now, we can debate whether that was a good idea or not. I would not say it is. as a result of that, the United States gets all this new territory, basically the southwestern part of the current United States. Mexico hands that over, which sounds like a good thing for the United States, but here's the problem. We haven't resolved the slavery question. And so the first question is, well, are we going to allow slaves in these new territories, in these new states? And both sides are very anxious about the answer. And basically getting all that new land as a result of the war with Mexico, I don't want to say it directly brought about the Civil War, but it was a big factor. I was going to make some analogy about how you're lighting a match and starting a fire, blah, 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 but just forget it. It was a factor. Here's the third thing. Andrew Jackson, love him or hate him, and I'm frankly not a fan, but he was a big, important, consequential, popular president. And he went back to Tennessee in 1845 actually way before 1845, now I think about it, 1837 is when he left office. Went back to Tennessee and lived until 1845. So between the time he left office, and the time Abraham Lincoln came in 1861, kind of slim pickings for presidents. Van Buren didn't do great. Harrison died after a month. Tyler didn't do great. Polk, a lot of people are Polk fans, but okay. Taylor died after a year. Fillmore didn't do anything. Pierce was just flat awful. Pierce and Buchanan, the two that preceded Lincoln, people routinely put them in the list of worst presidents. So you don't have great leadership, right? Now, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster have all died by 1850, say 3 or so. You've had 15 years of weak, ineffectual presidents, and you're going to have another 6 or 7 years of that before Lincoln comes along. That's a recipe for disaster. You have tensions increasing. People are unhappy because they want to know if slavery is going to be allowed in these new states or prohibited in these new states. You're starting to see people look at people in other states as the enemy. You don't have great leadership in Congress anymore because those guys have gotten old and died. You don't have great leadership in the White House because, I don't know, just haven't chosen anybody great, or nobody turned out to be great. Maybe it's bad luck. Maybe it's, who knows? But it's a problem. This is how you get to the Civil War. People think the Civil War just came out of nowhere. Like, oh, everything was fine, and then Lincoln got elected, and the Southerners said, nope, not going to deal with it. No, this built up a long time. This was building up, arguably, since before the United States existed. And it would bubble up to the surface, and people would do their best to try to cobble things together and keep it together and scrape and get through the situation. Was it inevitable? I don't know. If I had to guess, I'd say probably. But don't gloss over how terrible it was. This is not a war where you sign up and you go off and fight on the other side of the world and you're trying to find a terrorist in a hut in Afghanistan. This is fighting the people that you know. This is fighting your neighbors. This is fighting the people who are Americans. You're fighting other Americans. 600,000 people died in the war. All of them American. We killed our fellow Americans. It doesn't matter which side you were on. There's nothing that anybody's going to say to convince a rational person that the Civil War was a good thing, right? It's a tragedy. And what we're looking at this week is how it happened. And so what I have given you here in this summary is a couple of different factors that you want to recount in your summary. The big three, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, who held things together, but then eventually, inevitably, passed from the scene. Poor leadership, not a run of great presidents, and not a run of great senators and representatives in Congress during that period of time. And then you add fuel to the fire. There's the analogy I was looking for. by adding all that new land after the war with Mexico. So that's your simple summary. It's not that simple because it's a complicated event, but do the best you can in recounting this, and we'll go from there. All right.